Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had with Joe Saward, one of Formula One's most independent and insightful journalists. We brought Joe in to answer a question American F1 fans have been asking for decades. Why, across nearly 40 years of racing, have so few Americans made it to the grid? As you'll hear, the answer isn't about talent. It's about a system that was never built for us, and whether that's ever going to change. But before we get to our conversation, I need to ask, can you help us out? If this show adds value to your F1 experience, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app. Share this episode with other F1 fans. That's how people find us, and it's how we keep growing this community. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Okay, gentlemen, I am wanting to have a conversation with you that I think we've had other conversations, either Dick, John, me, and we've also had conversations with other guests, but I'm excited to actually bring Joe into this conversation with us because, Joe, you bring in the European perspective of a question that I think many Americans are trying to understand is, why don't we see more Americans on the grid? And Joe, since you've covered Formula One since 1988, in that time we've had limited, I would even say infrequent Americans attempt the grid, and that's across nearly 40 years of racing. So when you compare that to the number of like British, Italian, French drivers over that same period, what does that tell us? Is it about talent, or is it something else that's going on?
It's about a number of things, including talent. I'm not saying that Americans are less talented, because that's not true. But the talent is developed differently at a younger age too. The focus that exists among European racers, and I don't just mean European racers, I mean people who go to race in Europe. So, for example, Zhou Guanyu from China, he got on a plane at age 14 and went to live in Europe. And that's why he's got a slight Yorkshire accent, which is a bit odd for a Chinese bloke. But, it's an indication of he was completely immersed in the racing scene. And that's really important, not just because you learn how Europeans race, but for many, many other reasons.
Yeah. And, I think it's interesting because if you look at the model of the Americans who have gone over there, who have wound up having success as professional racing drivers, not necessarily F1, but maybe they come back to the United States and run sports cars or Indy cars or whatever. Almost all of their stories are very parallel in that they had raced quite a bit as very young kids in the United States. And when they were about 14 years old-ish, they came over, raced a season or two in karts, went into single-seaters, and at some stage, they either kind of made it to F2, borderline F1, and maybe do a few F1 races. I'm thinking of that, like Alex Rossi, and then wind up going to IndyCar and having a very successful career. Or they could be like a Patrick Long, who did really well in the United States in karting, goes over, CRG factory driver for a season or two, went through the Red Bull program. Scott Speed got picked over him, but Patrick worked the deal. He's a pretty good friend of mine, and he's super cerebral, right? I mean, a really intelligent guy. And he played the game very well. Porsche picked him up, and he had a fantastic career racing sports cars, wins Le Mans, all that kind of stuff. Hell of a story. I mean, Patrick, okay, didn't make Formula One, but anybody would be happy to have a career like Patrick had if they were just wanting to be a professional racing driver. I think that's part of it, right, Joe, that you're talking about is these young guys get immersed in the culture and figure out the language and the food and how do I find the train, and that kind of stuff.
It's everything. Your life is completely different. When you go away on holiday, if you travel abroad, if you're in America, everything's easy, everything works. If you want to plug something in, it works. If you go out, they have these strange plugs. I mean, it's not so bad nowadays with mobile phones and things, although roaming charges are entertaining, shocking. And but it's the food, it's the lifestyle. If you go to Spain, you just have to get used to eating at 9 o'clock at night, and some people struggle with that. And also, because America is such an easy place to live, if you like. the amount of dedication necessary to not just go, I can do this at home and make a ton of money and have all the girls chasing around after me or whatever, racing drivers, their primary motivations is basically they can go home and do it. And they, unless they're really, really driven, staying in Europe is tough. And there's the languages too. Always give young drivers, the first thing I say is, how many languages do you speak? And they tell me, I said, find another. Because the guys in Europe, the Nico Rosbergs of the world, speak 4 languages fluently and can do interviews in English, French, German, and Italian. So you have Scott Speed, who came over and spoke American. It's difficult. And so there are all these elements. And then there's also a question about the way people drive, or the way people race, rather. The style of racing is different.
As you were speaking, Joe, I got thinking a good friend of mine is a driver named Jan Halen from Belgium. And Jan came up through the Mercedes junior program and all that. And so what was interesting, I talked to him about how he started and all that kind of stuff. And when he was 14 years old, living in Belgium, his parents basically allowed him to go live with the importer of the barrel kart for Belgium. And he literally was homeschooled by this family that owned this distributorship. And he raced with them, and he was doing 600-700 laps a week. And every day was running and sweeping the shop and doing his schoolwork and all those things for several years. And of course, he was a European karting champion and won the Formula Ford Festival and all that kind of stuff. I mean, he's a hell of a race driver. It's not just the American kids that have to be immersed. It's the kids over there in Europe who wind up getting immersed, because that's seriously hardcore. And what I found is so interesting is that Jan has coached a number of young American karters over here that I have known. And he has basically pulled the parents aside and said, look, your son is an average talent at best. And oh, by the way, he doesn't really have the dedication to improve. Don't waste your money. I mean, hard message, but incredibly fair. I think what you're saying is, I start thinking about some of the guys that I know who, raced in Europe. You're so spot on the money. It's a completely different mindset. The intensity level is way higher.
I mean, listening to you guys, I totally see your perspective. I would also make some distinctions. A Chinese versus an American racer, you have a thriving ecosystem inside of America that incentivizes staying here, versus in China, which has a developing ecosystem, I would say, that it still needs to be further developed. And the proposition for parents, I think, is a very different question. The idea of sending a 13-year-old, a 10-year-old to Europe when the incentives are to stay here, and you have the management, the consent, it's all baked in to want to be here. But you have to make the decision as a parent that your young karter, your young racer, if he goes to Europe, he can be at any circuit almost every weekend within a few hours. Even here in the United States, that's not even the case. For us in Texas, we're very lucky in North Texas to have some amazing karting tracks that are within an hour of either Dick or me or John. But many karters across the country have to go quite a bit to get to somewhere, to get to a karting track. So I think those are some of the things that parents who see talent, and that's even a question of, is it their own perception of their kid's talent? Or, as you just said, someone giving them the hard truth of, hey, your kid really doesn't have it. And when they're not maybe even incentivized, because we know that this sport needs the finances to be able to continue operating, there's an incentive to tell parents, your kid can do it, and you're sending your kid overseas now. Those are things I think parents are juggling with. So I see it as really as an infrastructure issue, and it's that geographic reality. I mean, do you guys agree, disagree?
I think that's partially right. But I think that it's an emotional issue too for parents. And one of the things that a lot of parents say is, you've got to study just in case you don't make it. There's no guarantee you're going to get, and therefore you should study. And There's a really interesting story about, there's a school in England, a public school, which means it's private. I know that's bizarre, but that's how it is. And that school suddenly, after years of having almost nobody involved in motor racing, they got to a point where they're like 4 or 5 drivers, all at the top level, including Oscar Piastri, Callum Ilott. I can't, the Deruvala, the Indian driver who was in Formula 2. There's an IndyCar driver who I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but basically they were all at school in the same place. And this was because they were all getting a proper education, but the school, which was near Stansted Airport in England, allowed them to go off for the weekend to go racing. And as long as they kept up with their schoolwork, they were allowed to disappear off and come back on Monday, having raced in the European Championships or whatever. And that was very clever, because once one lot of parents learned that this guy's doing this and he's doing both the things that they need and want, that's the kind of thing that makes the parents feel better. They've got to pay a lot of money, whatever happens, and the school ain't cheap either. But the fact is that way you have the two elements to it. So if it doesn't work out right, and for every Oscar Piastri, there's a whole bunch of guys who work in garages saying, I could have been a contender.
Well, I think that's the responsible parenting thing. It's not just about if you don't, succeed in racing, you want your kid to be a thriving member of society. So schooling is an important component to being able to do that. And so I think that's the parental dilemma. How do you mature both of those, their racing talent and them as human beings to society? And it's not an easy proposition here in the United States. It's even harder to do that overseas. You're just amplifying the challenge. We actually had, I don't even know if it's by the time we do this conversation, if this will have aired. We've done some interviews with local American racing parents, and the dilemma, especially for moderate to middle income families, this is an astronomical proposition that they're having to deal with when they're being told that their kid has talent, the kid's proving it out on the track. But I think goes back to something you said earlier, the way people drive is different between the two ecosystems. So as a parent, if you know that as well, how much do you sit here and invest in American racing when you know really where you need to develop your kid's talent is in Europe, is something that they're trying to grapple with. And if you don't have a high volume of discretionary income, you're looking at how do you fund it? And that leads me to my next question, is the economics. European teams have these driver academies. We're talking about like Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, McLaren. They identify talent, young, and fund their progression. What's the business model there, I guess, is the question. I think is a little bit opaque for a lot of people. Are they making long-term investments, expecting some drivers to fail, but a few to become champions? And why doesn't that model work for American talent while they're still in the U.S.? I have my perceptions, but I want to hear yours, Joe. And then, Dick, I want you to give the American perspective.
Well, I think the answer to that is that the teams which are funding these projects, or programs rather, they don't care where the driver comes from. In fact, they would quite like to have, someone from Africa. They were all desperate for someone from China. They'd like to have an American who can win, but you can't easily find them. When you find them, they've got to be the right everything, because, they'll only fund so many because there's no point in funding more than a few. So you fund the very best, and not just the very fastest. You get the ones with the right attitude. Attitude is absolutely key to get into these programs and to stay in them, because so many times we've seen Americans bought in. Red Bull have done it a lot of times, but people drop out because the attitude is wrong. And even being super fast isn't enough if you don't have the necessary mindset and the discipline and the energy and the adaptability to get to the top. Just as an example of that, Kimi Antonelli, he was a Grand Prix driver last summer before he graduated from high school. And he was actually still, he'd get out the car and he'd go off and be reading books for his exams. And it was totally bizarre, but that was the trick with it. He was 18 years old and he hadn't graduated. He graduated by thinking about June or something like that. And then, he won't go to do university, but he doesn't need to because
I don't think she needs to. Yeah,
he's already a
smart.
multimillionaire. But but he's on a long-term contract to Mercedes, and the reason they fund, just to go back to the original point, the reason they fund this is that when they get a really good one, they can see, and they'll have him under contract for X number of years, and therefore the price will be kept under control. So they will get back the investment made over time, because eventually when his contract ends, I mean, George Russell's under one of those contracts at the moment. Lando, I think, is under one of those at McLaren. These are guys who've had their racing paid for because they're so good, and they tick all the boxes. That's how it works.
Yeah, it's real interesting. To Joe's point, I've got a friend who manages a number of professional racing drivers and has been for several decades now. And he once told a young aspiring driver that, to this day, I think was probably one of those guys who should have made it, but he just had a few boxes that were not ticked, as you would say, Joe. And this friend of mine told this young driver, he says, listen, there's a bunch of really good-looking fast guys sitting in the grandstands. And the reason is because they didn't take the time to go and develop themselves in the other areas that they needed to develop themselves, about the consistency and learning how business works and at a young age and those kinds of things. And I think that is a piece of it, whether you're an American or a European, Chinese, it doesn't matter. You've got to be able to understand all those pieces at a very young age.
I think one thing, just to sort of finish off on that, we've talked a lot about Europe, but when you look at European racing, everybody in the world, the Brazilians come to race in Europe, the Japanese come to race in Europe, the Chinese come, the Middle Eastern guys come too, because that's where you learn how to do it. And that's where the cutthroat attitudes are, where everything is absolutely top notch. And if you stick around, there are Japanese guys who stick around in Super Formula and Japanese super lights, these other things, and they're very good, but they only go to, like 5 or 6 tracks ever. It's always the same tracks. They never go out. They never have to go outside their environment. And when you have to go, particularly if you have a language situation, Japanese, Chinese, etc., it's really tough when you're going out into the world to go and live life. And, as a journalist, I see this when I go to places where I don't understand a word they're saying. If I go to China or China, there's very few English speakers. Most of the other places, Middle East, there's a lot of people who speak English. And Russia was another one where it was like sort of, wow, I'm in an alien environment here. And it's really interesting. But when you meet the people and you get to know the people a little bit, and you find a way to communicate, they're just people. But you've just got to get through that difficult bit, and also the homesickness thing as well. There's a lot of emotional things that need to be mastered.
I don't disagree with you. If anything, I would say is it's easy for us as adults to see these elements, but we're asking this of kids at 10, 11, 12, and it's their parents who are having to make the decision of creating the environment for that to happen. I know I'm always impressed by Joe because of the decision his family made to send him to England at such a young age and the language barrier. But I think it was, who was I listening to? He's actually currently on the grid. Oh, it was Franco Colapinto was talking about when he was, I think, a young teen, his days were going to the track, and then on the weekends, everybody would leave, and he's just sitting in a little apartment at the team facility. I think that's a hard thing to ask of a parent to send their child. I guess I'm looking at the cost-benefit analysis. Because the difference in incentive is what I keep coming back to, is if you're telling your parent your kid has talent, we have a thriving American ecosystem that will allow you to still, maybe it's not the pinnacle. Americans are going to really have a hard time with me saying that. I'm not saying I agree with that proposition. But I'm saying is if you're investing finances and you're putting your kids' human development in the mix, and I'm telling you, you can stay here in your home country and facilitate that and have a good professional career. He can make it into Indy. He can make it into NASCAR. Or I could take it the riskier proposition of your kid is going to live solo at 10 years old somewhere. That's a hard ask. Or as a parent, you need to sell everything, move over there, replant your life. Who knows if you have other kids? I can see why parents struggle and why that has now created a pipeline problem for American talent to make it there. Where other countries, because they don't have that thriving ecosystem, it's either choose to stay here, do those 5 races, like you said in Japan, or go over and go all in and see what happens. And that's why I think you still see European dominance.
I think that's the point I was making about the schooling thing, where you've actually got that, and the parents don't need to be there, because going away to boarding school, and I did that when I was young, it gives you. I would not be a Formula One journalist if I hadn't had the education I had, because it gives you independence from a young age. And honestly, when Kimi Antonelli turned up, and he's so grown up, he's so switched on and everything, and I thought, wow. When I was 18, I was a total fruitcake. I mean, I had certain things that helped, but I could not have done any of the stuff he did, and I would have done I did some really dumb things, as you do when you're 18. I think you need to understand that all these young racing drivers are so grown up. In fact, in some respects, they're too grown up. And I've seen that over time with a number of them who sort of go back to having their teenage years when they've made it. You know, they have phases they wanted to be singer-songwriters or whatever. You know, I think Jacques Villeneuve did that, and Lewis Hamilton went through that as well. They did things that you do when you're a teenager because they didn't have proper adolescent years, if you like. So it's an interesting thing, but what is the most important thing of all is the commitment to actually do it, because if you get to 19 and you haven't done it, it's too late.
Dick, I think you bring a great perspective on young American wanting to develop his talent. What Joe just said resonate with you about like the human development that happens as a result of being a racer?
Oh yeah, no, I think that's absolutely spot on. And you know, I think about there's a young karter here in North Texas that Sabrina and I know, and he's 13 years old, and he's kind of at that, you know, it's time to move into cars kind of thing. And it sounds like that's going to happen. What's interesting, and to Joe's point, is this is a very mature 13-year-old. You know, I mean, he's been doing it for a long time. He's actually come up with some very creative ways to help his parents raise money to support his racing, you know, having events at restaurants and stuff like that, where, you know, he cuts special deals with the manager of the restaurant and things like that, and raising, you know, a few $1,000 for a 12 or 13-year-old kid. That's super impressive. And you don't see that.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because you have maturity and then you have maturity. And that's the other point I was sort of making, is that you have racing maturity, if you like, and then you have real maturity. Sometimes they get out of sync with one another.
For sure. And so anyway, it's just a different breed. And you see these guys by the time they're 21, 22, and they know that, hey, I'm probably going to just be a karter and race. And that's not just a bad thing. They can go and do it for the love of the game, and nothing wrong with that. But they're on to doing other things. And yet they carry themselves completely differently than their peers. And that's a good thing and a bad thing, because they could lose it when they're 35 years old and say, wait a minute, you know, what are those kind of deals?
Well, the discipline that comes with being a racing driver can translate into business later on. And that's why a lot of ex-racing drivers become very successful in other walks of life, because they are driven and focused and determined, and you know, they have the tools that other people take a lot longer to find.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, Joe, one thing I wanted to talk to you about too, you mentioned adaptability. Would you define that from your lens as to what you see about what do you consider adaptability?
Well, the adaptability in every aspect of life. I've seen it with Japanese people, for example, coming to Europe. The diet is a problem. You have to be able to adapt to it. Actually, the diet's really important. If you talk to some of these coaches in Formula One, if drivers are eating the wrong things, their physical development, even their mental development, is different to the people racing in Europe, because if you're eating fish and rice all the time, which is, you know, a very Japanese thing, you are actually developing differently. So there's that kind of adaptability. There's the adaptability of going from country to country, and that's cultural adaptability, I suppose. you also have racing adaptability, which is, I mean, you racing drivers mix with mechanics, so the first words they learn in foreign languages are usually, or in English, if they're foreign drivers who don't speak English, the first words they learn are usually pretty juicy, and which is why some of them have run into trouble in the past with the FIA saying, "Hang on a minute, you can't say this or this because that's terribly naughty." We don't know that. This kind of stuff. But there's also just the style of racing. The style of racing is different. For example, when Herta, Colton Herta, decided he was going to come to Europe, he was in Europe before. He was in Europe for a couple of years, I think, and did pretty well. But went back. I don't know why, probably because of money. But, and then he's sort of settled into IndyCar, getting paid a lot of money, playing in a band at weekends. And I heard playing in a band at weekends, forget it. That's not going to happen in Formula One. If you're going to be in Formula One, you're not going off and playing in bands at the weekend. You haven't got time for that. You've got to be on it. You've got to be learning all the time. You've got to be just adapting all the time. And so that's what I mean by adaptability. That you just have to be able to change yourself in the right direction. And you have to listen to other people, which is another thing about adaptability. If you don't listen to what you're being told, you're never going to adapt.
Yeah, it's the whole gamut. Go ahead, Sabrina.
I was going to say, taking kind of that adaptability, I want to ask about the question of, there's a community aspect to racing. Like we've talked about that, like the way people drive, the style of racing. So if you're racing in Europe, it's generational as well as it is here in the United States. You end up having kids whose fathers raced with people who are now running teams, managing circuits, coaching drivers. There's essentially this camaraderie of an insider status that comes with being a part of that community. So when you have an American who shows up, even with talent and funding, they're inherently an outsider. How much do you think that matters? Do you feel that the community is welcoming to that? Does it actually affect the opportunities, information flow, getting the benefit of the doubt when things go wrong? Or do you think that there's something that has to kind of break through? This isn't so much a responsibility on the racer as much as I'm looking at the actual community that they're coming into.
Well, it depends on, again, there are many answers to that question. But certainly, if there's a driver who's quick and who's over early enough, there is no problem with connecting up to the sort of village attitude that exists in motorsport. I mean, it's bigger than a village now, but we call Formula One the village or the circus. And if you're good, they'll let you in. If you're good at what they will welcome you with open arms because they're all looking for the speediest guy around. They don't care about the rest of it. I mean, there are limits, obviously. There are people who are completely incredibly quick but say the dumbest things and stuff like that. And do the dumbest things too, and that can wipe out careers just as easily. So Formula One or motor racing in general in Europe welcomes anybody who's quick, willing to learn, and pays their bills. It helps a bit of honesty. Is there a sense of entitlement? Perhaps. Americans have a funny view of the world sometimes. I'll probably get into trouble by saying this, but when dealing with foreigners, you just talk in a louder voice. The English do it too, to be fair. Or people assume that you're going to speak they will speak your language. And these kind of things rub people up the wrong way. So, and this is one of the reasons I say languages. Learn as much, even if if you can only say hello, goodbye, please, thank you, and my name is Fred. In Arabic, Japanese, Chinese, whatever, that all helps. The people who are really well prepared, the ones who can do. I mean, if you watch Toto Wolff in action, and you of course you probably only see the English coverage of him, but he will turn around to another set of cameras and he will do the same thing in French. He'll turn around, okay, a bit mangled French, but he'll turn around and do it in German, and he'll do it in Italian, and he can do it all of them. And this is so important now. Lewis Hamilton can't do that, but Lewis Hamilton is Lewis Hamilton. He's super fast. So the thing is, if you've got two drivers who are both super fast and one speaks 4 languages, who's going to get the job? That's really clear.
Yeah, it's all those extra intangibles beyond just speed.
Well, and I think it also goes to the holistic development of a driver that creates a package that will incentivize the teams to see that this is basically ready to ready to plug into their system. That if they're able to have those language capacities and do what Toto, you just said, does, then that means it's higher marketability. Their media training may in the past have been in your native language, being confident to speak to, like, especially since most people speak English, then you're fine. But having the ability to navigate these other ecosystems of media, especially now that we have globalization of media, means that your marketability and your ability to think on your feet, if you've trained that. So I can see why that would be a value. I mean, I'm a person who speaks multiple languages. I grew up with a global perspective because my parents are immigrants from a different country here to the United States. So what you're saying, even if I'm pushing back, actually resonates with me because I always have grown up with a global mindset. I think some Americans might have been shocked by your statement about boarding school because that's so counter to how we raise children here in the United States. And so that jump of handing your child to an institution where really our perception is the child's development happens in home. Parents also are highly, in general, Dick, you can disagree with me. I'm not a parent, but I have many children in my life. All the parents in my world are very in tune to what's going on in the school, are there every day with their kid, working through their homework, attending all their events. So that's where I think that there's that cultural distinction. But going to your point, when you're making that cost benefit analysis, if you believe your kid should get to those levels, you're going to have to adapt. You're going to have to operate within the system.
Let me kick in here on something. I won't say the name, but there was a young American driver, and I was helping out somebody doing sort of, it was actually, we were assessing who was the best young driver to get backing. And one of them was an American guy. And my job was to try and trick them and do media tricks. Now, I'm not a media tricks kind of guy, but I played along and did it. And he's a lovely guy. Like him very much. But I got him talking about politics, and he was going on about things around the world about politics. And I said to him finally, I said, what on earth are you doing? You are talking about foreign politics, of which you may know a little bit, but you're a racing driver. If somebody asks you about politics, you say, I don't want to get involved in that. I'm a race driver. You don't start spouting forth about the problems in Israel or whatever, And things like that. There are attitudes that you don't even think about because the society is different. There are just things that you need to learn one way or another. And generally, by trial and error, that one learns these things.
I think a great case in point, again, I don't know where this episode will air, is that we're watching the Olympics right now. And I don't know if this has come into your radar. You're very global in your media consumption, so you probably have seen this. But a number of American athletes have been asked questions regarding American politics and things that are happening in the headlines. And it's causing a little bit of a controversy here because there are people who are saying, you're representing the United States. Why are you talking on these points? And I could argue, again, the lawyer in me can argue both ways. But one thing I think is often missed is that it's exactly what you just said. The question was asked. This wasn't an unsolicited answer or political statement, at least from the things that I've consumed so far. And as I watched it, I kept thinking as a media person going, well, not a media person like you, but someone who's done media training for policies and political people, you don't need to answer every question. You just say a very standard answer and move on. And because now in the age of this global media, instant media consumption, your quick soundbite that might have been seemingly innocent could actually be used to destroy your entire brand. And that's even a liability to the team, the sponsors, all. And so those are things I think parents of young racers or racers that are making their way through the system do need to be mindful in their home countries. But you bring a great point that it's really a global perspective now, and having that training to know what's being said, even something as simple as language, will help you in that. Dick, I feel like Joe and I have gone back and forth a bit. Do you want to jump in?
Well, being the native Texan, we look at things a whole lot different because we're not that crazy about Washington. Let's just be real here. And so I hear everything that y'all are saying. And actually, I do would like to think that I've got a bit of a global view because I have gone and done a lot of international travel myself. I think that until you're there, living in a particular country, you can't possibly understand exactly what's going on. You may have an opinion, but everybody's got an opinion, so who cares? It's pretty much keep your mouth shut, and say, hey.
To be fair to Americans as well, there is a tendency of foreigners to do the same thing the other way around and not to understand the culture. I'm fortunate to, and strange, if you like. I used to be married to an American, and I have a son who's American, and I now married to a French person, and so I'm very multicultural, but I do understand the things you say and don't say in different countries. You don't go to Canada and say, how are things going here in the 51st state? Well, no, I mean, people do silly things like that, and you have to understand the relationship between the Chinese and the Japanese and the Germans and the French and all kinds of things. And it's generational too. It's not just Mason thinks this, because generations are different too. So there's all kinds of things that you can fall foul of. And I've done it many times. And, I've looked at it and what I said and I go, oh my God, that's so stupid that you actually said that. But you learn and you don't do it again. Thing is, if I'm not particularly high profile, but if you're a young racing driver and you're saying dumb things like that, which we all do at some point, that can cost you your career. And that's maybe not fair or right, but it is actually true.
Yeah, I mean, we saw what happened to Tommy Byrne years and years and years ago, right?
Absolutely. I knew Tommy very well. Tommy and I had lots of adventures together, but he just did everything wrong. And Dan Ticktum, to be honest, these days, Dan Ticktum, who's now ended up in Formula E, he huge talent, and he blew, I think, 3 different chances of a good career just by his behavior. And I think in the end he realized, but by the time he realized, it was too late. And it's sad because when you have people who have enormous talent and they blow it for different reasons, there are some, and that's another thing I think which we haven't touched on, but there is a tendency to think of things, well, in the days of James Hunt, you could do this. Well, you could, but you can't anymore. You can't use yesterday's ideas. And this is what happened to Michael Andretti when he came to Formula One. He was doing stuff that had been okay in his father's era, but it didn't work anymore. And, then that was to do with flying backwards and forwards and commitment and being in the factory and all these things that are second nature to the European races. But because it worked before, this works, right? Not anymore, it doesn't. So you have to bear that in mind as well. So sometimes you might be getting advice from people who you think, oh, brilliant idea, fantastic, but it's not actually the right advice.
I love that. I think that's so true. And if anything, that's like a mini case study. I want to ask you some questions because for especially some of the newer fans who've maybe come in the last 5-10 years, Logan Sargeant's the most recent American that's come into the grid. I want to kind of explore a little bit what went wrong. He came through Williams Academy. He got a shot. It didn't work out. When you look at his trajectory, where do you think things went wrong? Was it the preparation, the team sport, the pressure of being an American, the equipment? What lessons do you think we can take as fans from that experience? The other thing is there's been some discussion about whether Williams gave Logan adequate support versus just needing an American driver for commercial reasons. So from what you saw, was that even a fair consideration or criticism? And more broadly, whether a team is genuinely invested in developing that racer or just filling that seat.
No. They're always invested in developing races. They're not putting money into it for fun, or just because if a driver comes along with a pile of money, that's different. But that the number of paid drivers in Formula One now is almost. It's not quite finished. There's still Lance Stroll and a couple of others who get support behind them wherever they go, like Sergio Perez is always supplied by Mexican sponsors. So it makes him more attractive, if you like. In terms of Logan did a huge amount, very successful when he was very young. A good-looking boy, come from a wealthy background. And I think there was an element in him, like well, how can I possibly not succeed? And he was very good in the junior Formula as well. But when he got to Formula One, he just didn't seem to be able to. And maybe it was because he was shocked by what it took and disappointed that his God-given talent, or whatever you want to call it, wasn't working anymore. But I remember Oscar Piastri, who'd been his teammate along the way. And Oscar said to me one day, he said, "What is going on with Logan? And Logan he's better than this." And even Oscar, who'd raced with him for years and years, didn't understand. And the real answer was that Logan's mentality was wrong. And I think that Logan got into the kind of belief that Williams were not doing it right for him. And the minute you have that in a driver, there's going to be a pushback on the team. The best way for any driver to be successful is to be utterly honest. If you screw up, you say, "I screwed up," because they've got data on everything you do. They know if you screwed up. So if you don't tell them the truth, or you try and blame it on something else, or whatever, or you think that the car's not good enough. I mean, sometimes maybe the car's not good enough, but you have to stay in with the team. And I think there was a level. To be fair to Williams, they kept Logan on for like a year and 3/4. And they gave him plenty of opportunities. And they told him, pretty much in the second year, you've got to deliver now because we have delivered for you. And it just got, in the end, he was just pushing so hard, he kept crashing all the time. And it was unfortunate because otherwise he had it all, on paper he had it all. And I'm sure he'll have a terrific career somewhere else in sports cars or Indy cars or whatever he wants to do. But I think that there were just elements in the jigsaw puzzle of Logan Sargeant. There were a few pieces missing.
Do you think that some of that was adaptability? Well, I wonder if, in just listening, and we talked about adaptability, do you think that played a role in that, Joe? I mean, it kind of sounds like that's what you were thinking.
It shouldn't really have done because he was racing in Europe. I don't think it's so much cultural in his case. I think it might be more, I think maybe he underestimated the task. Something like that. I don't know. To be honest, it's difficult to judge someone along those lines. But what I can say very clearly is it just didn't work. And the chemistry didn't work. And he wasn't slow. He'd have logically, he had all the elements, but it just didn't work. So what do you blame that on? I don't think you can blame it on the team because they really did. And, they could have fired him after the first year. And I know that was a discussion that was had. And it like sort of, no, we've invested in this guy. We want to make sure and give him the chance to really prove it. Second year, he knows the tracks because obviously the first year you don't know all the tracks. So that's more difficult. And you see that with Oscar, and you will see it this year with Kimi Antonelli. So, often 2 years is much, much more fair than just half the season. But after 2 years, if you're not delivering and not doing it, and it'll be the same this year with Colapinto, when you get into second years and you're not doing it, it's going to be bye-bye time, even if you've got the money behind you, because money doesn't do it anymore unless you have sort of Stroll-like ability to invest. But otherwise, it really is, you're out if you don't deliver. And actually, this is why I think Formula One's stronger and better than it's ever been, because there are not people who are there for the wrong reasons, or far fewer than they used to be. There used to be half the grid was there because of money. Nowadays, that's not true. And they're all very talented. And if you look at how close things have been in recent years, it's very clear that is the case. But, actually working out exactly went wrong with each and every one of them is quite hard.
Yeah. It'd be interesting, and this is way out, but the analytical brain in me is sort of like, man, it'd be really interesting to take a case study of 12 F1 drivers who seemingly had the talent but didn't make it, and come back to, was there a common thread of why it didn't work out for them? And then apply that to the young guys coming out and saying, look, here's the step that you do not want to take for this reason. One of those things. That'd be really interesting, but I don't have the time, and nor do any of us have the time to do that. But it'd be fascinating. It really would.
Well, as I'm listening to you, especially because of all the conversations John and Dick and I have had, and then now listening to what you're saying, Joe, I think it's a delicate balance. You have to have enough confidence in yourself to be willing to make these types of investments. And as a kid, that's really your parents having enough brutal honesty to say this is talent and talent that needs to be developed. And then that needs to translate into the actual racer. At a certain point, they need to have such confidence to say, I can just go out there and do and adapt to all these different things. But then also having enough ability to be receptive and self-aware to know that at any point their mismanagement of that or unwillingness to be brutally honest could totally destroy all that they're doing. And so I think as fans, why I wanted us to have this conversation is that it's very easy to sit on your couch and judge these people. You see these trolls on the socials who say these horrible things. And the guys know this. I have absolute respect for any racer who is racing because I'm not doing it. And I know that they're sacrificing a lot, investing a lot. And I think that it's so important that we realize that these are ultimately still human beings who are doing a task that none of us are truly doing. And there's a infrastructure around them that is a business model that is built around them that they're navigating. And the model, we want it to succeed because we want the sport to continue going forward. So it like you have to, criticism needs to be very mindful that we may not know all the pieces. And it's valid to have criticism. It's just the way that you deliver the message, in my opinion.
Yeah, there is one other point. And this was, I learned this one from Niki Lauda, would you believe? The BMW used to have a junior team program where they would put a bunch of guys through a bunch of tests. And one year I was sent along to help Niki out, if you like, just by having conversations, see how they dealt with the press, how they were in a social situation. And at the end of it, the discussion was going, well, who should be doing this? Who should be doing that? He uses his knife and fork very well. He speaks very good English. He's very presentable. He's this. And Niki goes, no, this is all rubbish. The only thing that matters is who is the fastest. And so BMW, we're looking for a German driver. And Niki said, we're choosing the Belgian.
Wow.
He is right. He was right because Eric van der Poel went to become a Formula 1 driver. He was unlucky because he was in the wrong team. But he was a very good driver and he won a lot of stuff in other things. But Niki was right. At the end of the day, what matters more than anything else is speed.
That's true. If you don't have the speed, nobody's going to give you a mind. So you have to have the full package. I love it. Dick, any final closing thoughts?
No, I think this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I'm glad that we were able to go and do it. Hopefully our listeners have gotten a lot out of it, because I certainly have. This has been great.
Yeah. Well, that speaks a lot because you've been a veteran of racing and are continuing to race. And you have a deep desire to see young American talent make its way to the grid. So I think that this only goes to prove the proposition that as a racer and anybody in this sport of motorsport, you want to be a perpetual learner. That was one thing you did say earlier about like not needing a college education. I was like, no, I want all of them to be educated and learned because that actually makes you a sharper person in the rest of your life. But I could get us off onto another conversation and we need to get going to our regular lives. So let's just leave this up to our next conversation. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, friends, what did you think of this conversation? We'd love to hear from you. What questions are you wrestling with? What should we dive into next? Send them to Sabrina at 2guysagirlandf1.com. We read every single one, and frankly, your questions are usually more interesting than what we'd come up with on our own. And with that, let me say, this ends our conversation. But we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in because we're just two guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.